I say, Claire, I'll pass over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Matt. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I know some of the names. I recognise some names. I think some of you will know me, but to those who don't know me, I'm Clare Paterson. I'm a data protection consultant and trainer, and my background is in social housing. My favourite clients are all in social housing, but don't tell anyone that they're my favourites. I've worked in and with social housing for 17 years now. I did 12 years at Bromford and left 5 years ago. So hello, Hazel, but I don't think we crossed paths when I think I left five years ago this month, I think. I left Bromford and went out on my own, and have continued to work with housing associations. I'm also a member of the data protection team at Anthony Collins Solicitors, who some of you will probably use. They're in that sort of social housing world as well. So I advise on a lot of kind of when things have gone wrong issues, and I'd like to be able to be much more proactive than reactive and not be fighting those fires. And part of that for me is challenging housing associations, especially to think about the journey, the customer journey from the beginning, and what data are we collecting and what are we keeping and what are we doing with it all the way through, so that we don't get to the point where it's firefighting, or we're less likely to get to the point where it is firefighting.
What I'll quickly do is a couple of bits of etiquette, and then we'll get started with some of your questions as we kick in today. So like I say, to anyone who hasn't been before, please feel free to enter anything you like at any time into the chat function. I'll be reading those and bringing those in, but more importantly, if you'd like to get involved in the discussion, these are always meant to be more of an open forum of people diving in and asking questions and sharing their views. Just use the reaction symbol at the bottom of your screen, the raise hand. I will then bring people in as we go through, always prioritising people who haven't spoken before. But you'll see how it runs. Then obviously, and I'll lower the hands and that kind of thing. But Claire, I'll pass over to you to start with kind of some of the questions and I guess how we came up with the topic for today.
Yes, well, I'm not sure how we first started talking, because I know we've been connected for years and years, haven't we? And not really spoken much. And then
the joys of LinkedIn.
Yes, the joys of LinkedIn. I noticed the round tables and didn't realise how often they were happening. I've joined the LinkedIn group. You should join if you've not joined. And I'm so impressed you do these weekly, by the way, Matt. I do a monthly get together, and I haven't gone through the summer, and monthly is more than enough. But I'm always obviously keeping an eye on what's happening in the news. And as we know, we've got Bromford and Clarion at the moment have got big issues with cyber attacks. And I've been involved behind the scenes with a lot of other housing associations as well. As I say, fighting those fires when things have gone wrong. So, and as I say, I like to challenge. I like to play devil's advocate and excuse the people razzing about at 11 o'clock in the morning outside the window, but I can't close the window, it's too hot. And so I wanted to put this challenge to housing associations and not be talking to just data protection officers, because we're kind of all thinking the same way anyway. We need to be getting to the people who are using and collecting the data and get your feedback. So Matt put up the poll, does social housing hold too much data on its tenants? And we've got overwhelmingly, the answer is no, we don't have too much. We either need everything we've got, or we just don't use it well. And what that says to me, my first reaction to that is, what do we mean by too much, first of all? Are we on the same page when we talk about what too much is? Because there are different ways that we can measure too much data. So I'm thinking about it from 4 different ways, and let me know if this makes sense or if there are other dimensions that you would think about. But to me, too much or enough can be measured by what we know about each individual, what we know about people as demographics as a whole, our tenants, data that is maybe out of date or is no longer needed, are we still holding on to that? And do we have multiple copies of data? Have we got, you know, spreadsheets and lots of different pieces of software that have got the same data in it in lots of places? To me, that's how I think about whether it's too much or enough data, those 4 dimensions. Does that make sense to how you would measure or consider what too much or enough data is in your housing associations?
Please dive in, or just show a hand. Do people kind of think that that's probably about right if we're looking at too much data? There's a couple of nods there.
I've missed, or
would anybody add anything in?
I think that when we talk about data as housing associations, we tend to think of the systems that we've got that hold that data. So our housing management databases, our asset management databases, we don't think about the spreadsheets that various people have designed over the years and have downloaded data sets into. The documents that we've sent to other parties, to external stakeholders, that we've shared data and joint projects on. We don't think about data as being in that format.
Agreed completely. And Jill?
Matt, I think the other thing to contemplate is that this is a growing database that we've got. So having worked in the housing industry for a long time, we're collecting a lot more information than we used to. Now, some of that is rightly justified because we've become more involved in the support, welfare benefits advice, any kind of vulnerabilities. We never used to get involved in that back in the 80s, really. You know, we just collected rents, dealt with repairs. But managing the household and managing neighbourhoods has become part of our day-to-day duty. So what information do we need on the tenant for our landlord purposes? And then what other information do we hold enabled to manage tenancies, support tenants, and perhaps support the neighbourhood too?
I know we've spoken before, Jill, about just how data rich the sector is. It's wild how much there is. And I think this is where, and this is what we'll come on to, I think, shortly with Claire, is how do we break that down into what's needed, and actually do we need all this excess? Anna, let me bring you in and I'll jump back to Claire. Anna, please.
Thanks. I was just going to sort of pretty much outline what you just said there, to be honest. I think there's this fear around this sort of concept of big data, that if we don't have it, we're missing out. And people might not know what they want to analyse yet, but they want to make sure that they've got it just in case somebody asks them for that particular report, or, you know, a particular strand or trend or something. But until you know what it is, you shouldn't really have it, is sort of the tricky part to balance that with.
It is. Jill, yes, please.
Yeah, just to come back in on that one, please. Didn't it serve us well during COVID? Because if we hadn't had that amount of information, we would not have been able to support the people who really needed it in a crisis. So there's always that risk management approach to consider. Just thought I'd put that back in.
No, I completely agree. And Claire and I were actually talking about this just before we jumped on today, actually, was this. In fact, I'll let you explain, but exactly this almost fear. And it's the question I posed to you, because I know obviously when we did the initial poll, as you kind of mentioned, you know, 67% said no, we just don't use the data well. 18% said no, we need all the data. So that's like, was it 85% saying we need this information? I guess your argument back was, can you get it again, wasn't it? And I'll let you kind of go into that, really, because it was a really interesting argument.
Yeah, that just in case is, like you said, it paid off in COVID, but it's always a balancing act. And it is exactly that risk management Anna just said about, that it's, you know, balancing up the pros and cons. And the way I always look at it, and the way I, you know, my devil's advocate challenging hat on, is look at the worst case of, if you didn't have it, you know, could you get it again easily? If you did need it, and how likely are you to actually need it again? Versus the worst case scenario, if you had it but didn't need it and it got leaked or it got misused somehow, you know, especially when we're talking about sensitive data about health and sexuality and ethnicity and all these sorts of things, you know, that I'd weigh those two things up. The just in case versus, but what if it gets leaked? And I know we all like to think, well, we're all secure and we're not going to get breached and we're not going to leak that data, but it does happen. It happens a lot more than we know about, because I know a lot of them that have gone on behind the scenes that haven't become public.
So in your role, Claire, how have you advised people to make that distinction? Because it is a very, very difficult one. So as you say, you've worked with housing providers for 17 years, I think you mentioned. How do you help make that distinguishing distinction between
so there's the base of all the advice comes from obviously the law, and the law says that for something to be needed, for you to want to hold that data, the test is always, is it necessary for one of certain purposes? And that necessary is quite a high bar. Just in case is not going to hit the bar of necessary usually. The other thing though is I don't start with the law. I'll go back before we get into the discussion about the legal nitty-gritty and say, is it actually useful? Because even without considering the legal ramifications, it's more data to manage, it's more data to store somewhere, it's data to secure, it's more stuff. You can't see at the moment behind my cleverly placed room divider, but I have far too much stuff in this room, and I am on a mission at the moment to declutter. Stuff clutters the mind, and it's the same with data. Even when it's digital, there is a cost in storing it. There's an environmental cost, and there's a pounds and pennies cost to it as well. So I would, even ignoring the legalities of it, is it actually useful, or is it weighing you down in other ways? Plus that, the whole risk, as I say, I know about a lot of breaches that have happened that haven't gone any further with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. They're the UK's regulator on data protection. And there's been no fines or enforcement action, but there's still been weeks and weeks and weeks, as Romford are dealing with at the moment and Clarion are dealing with at the moment, and not just in housing, but charities and education across the board, weeks of trying to put their data back together, trying to put their systems back together, trying to get back to where they were, even if they don't get fined. So even putting the legalities to one side, it's the practicalities. And I would never make the decision for someone. I would always say, well, here's the things you need to think about, and then it is their decision. Sorry, Jill,
absolutely
you've had
agree. No, please don't. And that's it. We want to make sure points are clear and that we get the debate going. So Anna's put in the chat there that essential data 7 years post end of tenancy, but we should be better at filtering out the non-essential much sooner. And I think this is arguably where a lot of that distinguishing comes through. And then Thomas said, just knowing where to begin when looking to clear out old data is the challenge. Jill, let me bring you in, then I'm jumping to Claire.
Thank you. Just to say that the just in case argument, I get that totally, Claire, as to why that I don't think is quite sufficient either. But more so now than ever, we've got a bigger argument, which is about how do we tailor our services to the needs of our customers. And with consumer regulation coming down the track very quick, we've got that data in order that we can justify that, what we do in relation to tenant satisfaction measures, particularly, and making sure that we're able to meet the needs and expectations of our customers. We're having this conversation. I'm a non-executive director for NHS Foundation Trust, and we're having this conversation as well about how do we then support our protected characteristic groups, like to the extent that they need to be protected if we don't know who they are and where they are. So there's lots of other arguments about that. That I think would come into play, and not just about just in case we have another COVID crisis. Obviously, it's about making sure our services are fit for purpose, and it's about balancing that. I get that totally.
And I think part of it is probably around that piece of going, I completely agree with you, Jill. Like, I mean, if we're talking about EDI, and I know it's been a big part of your presidential campaign, I know the results come out this week, so the very, very best of luck with that as well. I hope it, I know that VP is going to be a really tight run thing. But when we're looking at it, if we had, say, one housing management system and the information was just saved there, I think we probably wouldn't be having this. It's when it's the multiple levels of data that seems to be, again, another part of the issue. But Claire Lawrence, I'm going to bring you in. I was going to say Claire, we've got two Claire, so Claire, I'll bring you in.
I just wanted to pick up on something that that Jill said about the data that we hold has served us well in COVID. You've got to remember, and I don't disagree, some of it has. However, COVID is, let's hope, a once in a lifetime situation arising, once in a several generations lifetime arising, and we shouldn't be holding that data just in case COVID happens again. How many years?
Do you find where you are at the moment, Claire Lawrence, with that kind of data? Do you feel you're holding too much? I haven't looked through in specifics of who voted where.
How many? My question, I suppose, is really back to the group. How many years have we held that data for where we didn't need to hold that data? Yes, it served us potentially well in this last year or two. However, how much time have we held that data for, and how long has it sat on a shelf, an electronic shelf perhaps, but just been in a dusty filing cabinet?
And housing isn't alone in this. And I think this is, and Clare Paterson will absolutely back me up. I mean, in the recruitment world, like, goodness me. I mean, I've worked on databases, and actually there's some in the room, I won't point fingers, but who I actually used to work with in the recruitment field. And there were years and years of data on there, and trying to go through that and cleanse it, it's a challenge, and it is almost a role unto itself. But Tom Prout, I'm going to bring you in.
Thank you. Hi guys. Just on that note, I'm just thinking, when we were talking about it, where do you actually define the pre and post COVID then, Claire Lawrence? As you're talking about the dates that we've needed for during COVID and pre-COVID, but what is the difference between what you need pre or post? I think that, don't you still need the same data on those people, on the history of that tenant or that customer? Does COVID really make a big impact in what data you're actually holding?
I think COVID changed. Yeah. I think COVID changed how we looked at it. So the data that we held on our residents, for example, in our older person schemes, we were holding data about their family contacts, their wider support circle, and we weren't actually using that pre-COVID. We just found out that once COVID happened, when our first lockdown happened, we suddenly thought that's useful. We'll actually contact those people. We'll make sure that our vulnerable residents do have access to support from their next of kin, from their wider family group. They're getting visited. Someone's bringing them their shopping.
I think when we talk pre and post COVID in this instance, I think it's lockdown. I think it's the lockdown that we really focus on. It's how much information we suddenly needed during that lockdown, because that was it was probably 2020 to mid 21, wasn't it? I can't even remember when we got out of lockdown 7 or whatever it was. Anna Henderson, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks. And I just wanted to say, one of the biggest eye-openers we had during lockdown was making the outgoing welfare calls to customers, and we realised quite how out of date an awful lot of our data was. But because people were in many cases really happy to have someone to talk to, we were actually able to do quite a good exercise about just updating people's vulnerabilities, needs, next of kins, etc., just because they were in that mindset of feeling that someone was reaching out to help them. When we try and do the sort of every 2 years rolling program, sending out a form, you get you're lucky if you get about a 6% response on household details information. So there were some bizarre bonuses that came out of lockdown as well.
And Clare Paterson, I know this is something that we talked about as well.
I always put the challenge to you. You're talking about we needed this data that we had kept kind of maybe just in case, or a bit too much data that we'd never used, and then we needed it when lockdown happened. Did we need it, or did we just go, oh, we could use that? What would we have done if we didn't have it? Would we have still been able to look after our tenants? And that's the challenge, and that's the crux really. Could we still have looked after our tenants, or what is there? Tell me, what is there that we couldn't have done if we didn't know all their next of kin and that kind of thing?
Jill, I'm going to bring you in.
Yeah, and I would say that we didn't just use our data, and I agree with what Anna's just said, totally, mind you, our data wasn't up to date, but we were able to use our data not just during COVID, whenever there was new welfare reforms that were introduced. We could target people straight away to make sure that they got advice quickly, and were fast-tracked down any process route in order to support them during universal credit when it was rolled out, as an example. So it wasn't just about COVID. So I get what you're saying about what data did we hold that we wouldn't have used otherwise. However, you just it's one of those known unknowns. You just don't know what's going to crop up next. And now housing providers have this much more holistic role. You want to be seen to be able to support your tenants and their families, their households, in any way that we can. So it wasn't just about COVID. I think it would be wrong to make it just about that. Welfare reforms is a good example. When the bedroom tax was introduced, when the benefit caps were introduced, but certainly during the rollout of universal credit. And the other one that comes to mind was when they changed refugee status. So we had something like 380 tenants who actually were affected by that. And if we didn't have the level of data that we had at the time in Biker, I'm talking about, then we wouldn't have been able to support them as quickly and as effectively as we probably could.
So if you hadn't had it, you could have still supported them, but not as quickly. Is that
wouldn't? It would have been like herding cats. We wouldn't have known where to start. We would have had to revert to the local authority to see what information they had, and we would have been trying to gather information from different places. But because we had that household information already and that level of information, we were able to just run a computer program that said, there are the people you need to target, welfare benefit advisors, go out and see them straight away. So it's not just about COVID, it is about those known unknowns that could crop up at any time, because we have a diverse group of tenants, all of us, and we, knowing who they are and who lives in their household, supports us through any kind of new legislation, whether that be benefit or refugee status, and certainly through any kind of tragic situation.
Jill, do you think there's an argument to be made that because exactly what you mentioned there, just on one of the points you mentioned there, Jill, do you think there's an argument that, as you say, all this was going on and it would have been herding cats trying to go to the local authority? So do you think actually the bigger issue was if the local authority had its data properly and those relationships were as smooth as they should be, and I'm saying that because obviously not all local authorities are the same, that actually you'd have felt more trust in not needing the data, because those trust levels aren't always there in the way that some local authorities react with some housing providers and vice versa, that everyone feels they all need to hold it.
Yeah, if it was a one size fits all type of situation, but it never is. It's a complex situation, and I think the landlord is rightly the one who should hold that generic information on their tenants and their households, rather than it be held in different places. Local authorities particularly aren't able to offer the services that they used to offer because of the cuts that they've had to endure over now quite a number of years, and there just isn't as much community support out there coming from the local authority or from the voluntary sector. So again, it comes back to the landlord, and my original point, which was we have become much more of a holistic provider in the housing sector than we ever were, and I've seen that be transformed to my staff having to be trained in lots of different subjects now that they never had to be before, in order to be able to sustain tenancies and help and support the families who are some of the most vulnerable families in society, let's face it.
They are. There's been a point made by Ian in the chat. When the COPI regulations expired, local authorities had to notify UK HSA of the purpose to continue to process confidential patient information under section 3.1. I'm going to jump back to that because Anna's been waiting, but that'd be an interesting one just to dive back to a second. Anna, let me bring you in.
Thanks. I was just going to pick up what Jules was referring to about the welfare reform changes and things. Obviously, over probably the last 10 years, there's been an absolute swathe of them, obviously. And one of the constantly changing sort of nature of that, I think, has led us particularly as well to suddenly go, oh, we need to create a new field in our housing management system, a new tick box, a new flag, a new circumstance. So actually, rather than sort of looking at what we have data-wise about customers already, there's always a need to kind of jump and find a new way to record it. And then you look back and go, so someone's got a tier 2 vulnerability. What does that mean? And you can't remember what iteration of whatever benefits implementation that was from. And I think that's something that we probably need to get a little bit cleverer about, is actually going, okay, so that maps very well to what we hold under this field here. Therefore, that will be our organisation approach, rather than trying to constantly adapt and you know, reconfigure systems, etc., every time there's a change imposed.
A lot of it is done under pressure, isn't it, and in a rush, and so it could be that, you know, the data is needed, but you've got a lack of governance around that data. No, you know, data dictionaries and data glossaries and all those kind of things that map, like you say, what this is to an existing field, rather than knee-jerk reaction, add a new field.
There's a big thumbs up
Definitely.
there from Dean, actually. Dean, do you want to dive in on that? Because that looked like there was a big agreement from you there, chap.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me okay. I'm currently on holiday in Cornwall, so I've got a lot of music going on.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, really nice here, actually. Really good. Yeah, I'm glad someone mentioned. I was going to jump in at some point with data governance, so I'm glad someone mentioned it. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic for me. I mean, there's quite a lot of views I have on sort of the data side. But it all does come back to that security side. No matter what we're collecting, no matter how much we're collecting, for what reason, there's always got to be governance around it. You know, essentially, we want to decide: do we want a reason to collect this data, or do we want to predict that we might use this data at some point? Or even there's the side of the coin of the data science area. I know not a lot of us are really jumping into data science, but when you're building predictive models, you need historic data. So sometimes we're thinking, oh, I need to start predicting this, but I've never collected the data for it. So sometimes when you've got a lot of data, you think, oh, actually, I could use that data with this, and I've got historic data to build these models. So there's a lot around that as well. But data sharing, data ethics is another one. I'll just throw that out there. But data sharing is quite an interesting topic, because I'm part of a DIN network, and we went to, I'm probably slightly going off just because of excitement, but we went to a research centre that I'd never been to before, and they were talking about building a sector-wide data set. So sharing data with, or building a massive big data set to solve sector issues with other, so all the housing associations pulling data together, police, local authorities, loads of other areas to try and start to do that sort of data science around it, but trying to solve sector problems. So again, that could be a new area where you think, oh, we decide to collect this data, we can start collecting this as a sort of a global housing association set. So but again, that's going to need massive governance around it, a lot of security, then the ethics around it. Should we be collecting this sort of data? And then essentially it's, well, if we're doing this to help the tenants and help people, this is why we want to collect this data, so we can protect. There was one, there's a lot around the IoT side of data as well. There was one, I think it was local authority, I've forgotten the name, but it was like really interesting, because they'd collected data from the toilets. And what they'd done from that is, because you wouldn't think to collect that sort of data, we had sensors in the toilets, but that actually started to predict health issues, and they started to save some. They found some of these older generation had health issues, didn't even know they had. And so there's things like that. You've got to. It's massive. It really is massive, and there's a lot of ethics around it now, because there is so much data we can collect. Everything from watches to mobile phones. There's so much out there. It's all disjointed as well, not like really brought together to sort of to build that big 360 picture. But I
think that disjointed part is a massive part of it, as are the ethics. And Claire, I know there are a couple of points there you wanted to dive back in on.
Yes, that's music to my ears to hear people say data ethics and data governance, and thinking about joined up thinking and that kind of thing. And what we can do versus what we should do is so important, and not just from a, well, should we, because is it right, is it useful, but is it lawful? I do need to bring it back to the law. You are risking, the more that you join the dots and the more that you say, oh, well, we've got this data set here, this one over here, we can put them together and work something else out about these people that they didn't know we were going to work out about them. How do we make sure we're doing it lawfully? And it's about looking at what our legal basis is. And as I say, all those legal bases, unless it's consent, have the word necessary in them. it is necessary to do such and such. Not we would like to, or we think it would help, but it's got to be necessary. And as I say, that's a high standard to meet.
I'm going to read out the point from Ian, and then I had a question actually after as well. So obviously Ian had mentioned before, Ian's from Leicester City Council. He said that when COP regulations expired, local authorities had to notify UK HSA of the purpose to continue to process confidential patient information. In that they were given access to loads of data to support folks, and some they could easily delete at the end of use, but some became part of people's records, and they had to kind of self-identify that and advise of their intention to retain. How easy is it to make those distinguishing from a legal perspective? You know, when you're going in and supporting businesses, where I guess my bigger question around that is, where are people holding, I guess, too much data? Where are those biggest, I guess, nuggets of data that actually you, not just that you don't need, but legally you shouldn't have, or aren't necessary based on obviously the terminology you've used there?
You asking me or Ian?
Yourself.
Okay.
So what
I see, it is health information. A lot of it that I see in housing actually that you're holding that you probably shouldn't be, is when the tenant has told you something themselves and you don't need it, but because we record everything now, we're recording, yes, we could go down a huge rabbit hole, and there are endless amounts of data, but a lot of it is what the tenant tells you themselves, and they want to tell you why it's so important they get this repair done quickly, or why they get this house move, and they'll tell you their whole history and their family's whole history. And we need to be considering, do we actually need that? Are we making decisions based on that data or not? If we're not, and it's just they told us this, then we shouldn't be keeping it. The other thing is, I'd like to come back to Jill's point. I see this a lot, and this is me put my devil's advocate hat on, Jill. I always say I don't go into data protection to be popular. You should never go into data protection if you want to make friends. But you were asking, how do we protect our customers that have protected characteristics if we don't know who they are and where they are? And I would say, well, why do you need to know where they are to be able to treat people fairly? Can you treat people fairly without knowing everybody's ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and so on? Are there some things that actually you can just have policies that treat people well? And if they are subject to hate crimes and so on, then you know then about the hate crime, and then you can deal with it.
Alison Leach has just mentioned,
challenge.
Yeah, Alison Leach has just mentioned Peeps, for example, in the chat there. Jill, I'm glad you dived back in, so that's great. And then I'll bring Anna in straight after. So Jill, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just posted in the chat as well. You bang on, Claire, you're right. And we did have massive hate crime problems in the area in Byker, and it came in the form of really bad antisocial behaviour. So we did have to target that head on, and it was amazing how we were able to deal with that very quickly and reduce it by 80% when we knew where it was coming from and what that was about. But the other side of that really is about making sure that your staff and board are representative of the communities that you serve. And again, in the NHS, this is something that's going to be critical for us when we cover big geographical areas. Which we do, because it's a mental health foundation trust, which literally our footprint is massive, all of North Yorkshire, the North East, and in some instances across to Manchester as well. And we must try to make sure that our staff are represented well, and that our board also are reflective of the communities and people that we serve. But I guess it always will come down to, as I've put in the chat, is can you justify holding it? And the test for that, the litmus test, is going to be, do you use it? And what do you use it for? And you're saying it's a high bar, and I think that's totally fair. I think that's a fair challenge, because in Byker, again, we had 29 different languages as the first language spoken, and how could we possibly get the accessibility right and get our communications right? The literacy age was 11, so it was more about pictures than text, and to have that level of understanding is really what transformed the area, because people, you get the relationships and the trust, and it's horses for courses. Not everybody will be the same. And it is a difficult line to tread, I guess, a very narrow line to tread. And the litmus test is, can you justify holding it, and do you use it, and for what purpose?
Yes, and do you actually have something concrete at the end that you can say, we did that because of that data? And I love the fact that you're collecting the languages rather than ethnicity, because ethnicity doesn't really matter, because you can be any background and speak English or not. But the languages is important because of accessibility. I can understand that. I see so often, sorry, Anna, I know I'm so passionate about this with the equality and diversity stuff. I've seen so often that the reports are based on, they look at who's in our communities, who do we house, versus who does the statistics of the that area say should be living in our houses, sort of thing, compared to that. We're way out, and we just explain it away with, oh, it's probably okay, because we don't actually do a deep dive. We don't see if we are putting people off. We don't see if there is a need that we're not meeting. We just explain it away, and the board goes, oh, okay, that's great. And that's, to me, that's useless. But
hey, no, look, it's a good challenge to have for the sector, certainly is. Just before I bring Anna in, Hadel's put in the chat there, housing associations need to be mindful of not discriminating on the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and I couldn't agree with you more there. I certainly know it's something that we've had many discussions about on these roundtables, in fact. Anna, over to you.
Just come off mute. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the duty of care point of view, putting my old lettings hat on from many years ago. When you're looking at sustainable communities and local lettings plans and things, that obviously you're looking at the broader picture, but there are on occasion much more sensitive matters where you do need to look at people's protected characteristics on an individual basis. And if you were to house someone potentially right next door to someone who's already got proceedings ongoing for harassment on particular grounds, etc., and you knowingly house them there, knowing that they had a particular characteristic that would make them vulnerable, you'd be open to enormous challenge on it. So it is about sort of not only trying to get that broad, balanced community that reflects, as people have said, the wider representation of their area, but sometimes knowing those particular individual data circumstances actually have massive real world consequences as well.
Yes, yeah, I completely understand that. I would say then, do you need to keep it on file forever though? Is it something you need at a point in time, and then you can get rid of it? Somebody made a point on one of the LinkedIn posts about core. We collect all the information for core, but that shouldn't be seen as the same thing as collecting it for the housing association. We send it off fairly anonymously to core, but does that mean that we use it and keep it on file forever, attached to the housing file? Which again, I've seen that, that there's the core. It used to be in the old days like it was a duplicate or triplicate form that was filled in by hand, and the one was pulled off and sent off to core, and the other one was actually attached to the housing file, where it's supposed to be kind of semi-anonymous, if not fully anonymous. So that would be my challenge there. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And actually, that was Anna who brought that up. That was,
was it? Sorry, I saw. I'd seen that.
No, the issue around core more than anything else was on the posts was more to do with the fact that we ask customers for the same information, as you said, a number of times, because you're asking for it for core, you're asking it for your own files, you're asking for it for potentially, other things. And actually, maybe I think someone was talking about a sector data set would be a much more customer-centric way of doing it. If you ask them for it once, they know who's getting it, where it's being shared. I think that would be
that's also one of the big frustrations, isn't it, Anna, is this whole point actually of tenants being asked time and time again, saying, well, I've already told you this. Well, no, you've told that team, or you've told these people, or you've told that. It's frustrating, and we all have it in our normal lives. If we're trying to get a complaint resolved in any situation and someone's asking you the same question, but we're a different team, or we're asking this or that, it just gets annoying. But I guess the problem is again, within that data protection and GDPR and everything else, how easily that data can be shared is again another challenge to to overcome and to make sure the right people have got access to it without people who don't need it having access to it.
And that transparency, you know, like Anna's saying, we collect it for core and then we collect it for our own needs as well. Well, we could just ask the question once, but say, we're giving this to core because we have to. Can we keep it on our files as well? And them actually being able to say yes or no. You know, that's a simplified version, but you know, that kind of thing. You know, it doesn't need to be all or nothing.
And I think there's the challenge, isn't it? It's finding that balance. And I know we've mentioned it a few times, but it's getting that balance right between holding what we need to and making sure that data is shared. When you've gone in and then worked with housing providers, because I'm aware this is obviously your business and what you specialize in now, is that data sharing something that tends to be done very well? It's just there's too many people access, or is the data sharing itself the problem?
Data sharing can be a problem. It's misunderstood quite often between you know, the other agencies where you've got I think Jill said about local authorities can be a pain, and the police, and sometimes there's a feeling that we should share everything and sometimes they won't share anything, and it can just be a complete nightmare. But I would always come back to, it doesn't matter whether you've got data sharing agreements or not in place, whether it's legal to share or not will always be based on particular things in the law. Having an agreement in place makes absolutely no difference. They can be useful, but they're not a legal tool. They just kind of give you a framework to work to.
And that probably ties in actually to what Claire's just put in the chat there, which is, can we talk systems? The best one I've ever used was small. The bigger the systems, much like organizations, the less relevant and tailored the systems are and harder to manage it. I take it you've worked with a few of them yourself, Claire.
Yes, yeah, and sister, somebody said, I think it was Anna, wasn't it, about the you know, we got this field and we've put a new field on, or we'll reuse this field for something else because it's not flexible. Like Claire's saying there, that we can't tailor it, so we need to use this field for another use, and that's when data gets messed up as well. And you think, you might even be thinking that you're that you're sharing a certain report, but actually the information in it is not what it should be because the field's been used for something else. So that's a real big, that would come back to what Dean's talking about as well, about data governance, that data science and getting that right.
And actually Tom Prowse agrees, and Jill will probably back this actually with her current role, which is a huge issue in the NHS. They can't have self-serve options. It's due to the sensitive nature of how much data is held because of the size of the beast of that is holding the data. But then if you haven't got it, again, it's finding that balance, isn't it? Because if you did have something which was more centralized, well, you know, this is slightly left field, but I know out in Australia, whenever they've got one job board, one place to post jobs for the whole country. And so actually it's easy to search for roles because you go on there and you search what you look. You're not searching through 10 different sites and putting your CV up everywhere. But it's managed, it's in, you upload your CV to one place. That works. Obviously it's a very different section, a very different sector, but as you say, when things get,
as well,
that's it. But when
impressive.
Things get so, but like I said, but they've kept it simple. And I think, as you've mentioned there, sometimes a lot of the issue is the data, and the data is only as good as the day you get it. I think this is obviously the other problem. It can go out of touch in 24 hours, as we all know from DBS checks and things like that.
Or we've got systems, coming back to Claire's point, the systems do not let you delete information that without everything else falling apart. And how do we deal with that? You know, how many ex-tenants have we got data on that we have no need to have their data, but because they're holding up the data, you know, the way that it's built, if we delete them, everything else falls apart. How do we deal with that? I know that's a huge problem.
Well, exactly what you've said there. Claire Lawrence has just put, yesterday was an issue was described to me whereby tenants can't just upload a new baby's details to a tenant portal without the whole thing breaking. I mean,
and that should be fairly simple because it would just be name and date of birth, I would imagine. You wouldn't be, you know, no.
Do you know what the problem was, Claire Lawrence?
Yeah, it is validating. So we have a data governance. We have a data governance process attached to every customer, every client record, and that the data governance system requires a staff member to have interaction with the resident reporting the new household member. And so they have to literally go to the front door and have the baby held up and showed to them. It's the customer saying they had a baby. If they say they've had a baby, they've had a baby. It's that simple, surely.
There's something in between, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's something in between that, you know, there should be something. I'd be interested to come back to Hazel's point of housing associations need to be mindful of not discriminating. Obviously, you know, I think we all agree with that. We don't want to discriminate. But I would always be challenging, again, it's the word I use a lot. Do we need to collect the information on those characteristics to be able to prove we're not discriminating? Or are there some instances where collecting the information can lead to more discrimination? And this is a discussion that I know you've already had, and
well, I'd actually just spoken to Hazel regarding actually jumping in on this, because I mean, I'm sure most people are now aware, but evidently Bromford have had a couple of issues with data as of late. And so I was actually going to bring in Hazel and I dropped a message in the chat and just to kind of go, have your views on, having just been through everything, have your views on what is essential data changed because of what's happened with Bromford?
So it's quite an interesting time for us. So just those who don't know, haven't heard, actually at Bromford on the 20th of July, we kind of detected that we'd had some malicious attempts to access our data and systems. So we made a really critical decision to shut down all of our technology, literally everything from that moment. And what we've been doing is investigating what has gone on. We have got no evidence of any data breach or that anybody's got hold of any data out of our systems. So the reaction was actually really quick, and we have safeguarded everything and protected what we had. We are now in the very difficult, challenging time of actually trying to reopen very safely all of our systems. So prior to this, completely coincidentally, we had just been through from the mergers that Bromford had with Merlin and Seven Vale, where we worked off 3 legacy systems. We had literally a couple of weeks prior to the cyber attack had launched transformation on D365, our new system, which has everything all in one place, which is fantastic for us because we have been working, you know, off various different sort of spreadsheets and data, and I'm sure that there's been things, you know, and so we embarked on, you know, this whole journey, which has been years in the making, and lots of colleagues have been involved in it, to do this transformation piece. And then coincidentally, we end up with this cyber attack at the same time. So we found ourselves in a bit of a strange parallel universe to the COVID situation. So in COVID, we were not able to go out, but we had systems. So we had systems that could tell us, you know, who to kind of like contact, what to do. And we were able to kind of follow up with people in different ways rather than being in person. With what's happened with us recently, with having no technology, we literally haven't been able to see customer data, but we've been able to go out in our communities. So there's been huge amounts of learning from all of this for us. And one of the things we noticed, sort of going back to the COVID situation, was we actually did pull off a kind of vulnerable customer spreadsheet, because that, you know, back then that's what we were trying to and get hold of, the people we deemed to be the most vulnerable for whatever had been ticked on our system, whether they had a health condition or it was their age. And when we started calling customers, some of them got very upset and said, I'm not vulnerable. And then other people in the community were contacting the neighborhood coaches because, you know, they all get to know their customers. We have a coaching approach, so our patches are really small, about 175 to 200 homes. So all of our neighbourhood coaches, you know, they know their customers, and they were contacting them saying, you haven't reached out to me, I'm vulnerable. So we had this real kind of situation where it's made us kind of look at things, because people's circumstances change. And when you look at, you're right, Claire, when you look at the 9 protected characteristics, somebody could change their circumstances based on those protected characteristics. So actually, how up to date are your systems going to be? And we can only do the best we can with what we know. And we just say to customers, a bit of a, you know what you don't know, or you don't know what you don't know, if you see what I mean. So it is really difficult. But the good news is for us is we are slowly opening things up and getting some read-only files, so we're able to start to open up our systems again. And there will be learning from this, and I'm sure we'll be sharing that with other providers as well. So we're just being very upfront and honest about our circumstances, which again, you know, I think that's really good for us to be doing that, and to, you know, we put things in Inside Housing, etc., and we put things on our website. So if anybody wants to look at anything, all the service updates are on there if you're curious about what's been happening to us.
With yourself, Hazel, obviously you've mentioned there you almost went from so much data to nothing. Did you find that service delivery changed dramatically by not having data, or do you think that actually improved in some ways or got worse?
Well, we're still recovering from the backlog, I think, on most housing associations from the pandemic to do with repairs. But actually, in the first sort of week of the cyber attack, we were still being able to carry out 75% of our service delivery, which is just fantastic. So that goes to show the communication happening within the community with the neighbourhood coaches, directly with those colleagues who don't have any systems, we're still able to go ahead. So again, I think our coaching approach came into its own and really proved the value and the worth of all that we do on much smaller patches, really knowing our customers, knowing what's happening and working really collaboratively with other teams.
And also not needing massive spreadsheets full of data to still be functioning and to support tenants in the way that you need to. Claire, I'm going to come back to you in 2 seconds. I just want to go through some of the messages come up on the chat, which is Anna mentioned how old school it was. Goes back to the days of rent a grand, which I think was the holding a baby side of it, which was great. Joe Simcox, great to have you with us, Joe, who's actually going to be joining me on a future roundtable. So looking forward to that one. I found that an issue where some housing associations have a mistrust of customers, i.e. considering themselves to have mobility issues to assist with accessibility needs. The challenge I encountered is what if they're lying? And Mal Sagoo, who's also with us, again, been on roundtable before, it said, it's interesting. I think your discussion points to how the sector adapts to move forward. As we enter the winter period and dependent on the fuel cap, which will be announced on 26th of August, fuel prices are set to triple. In order to help and identify our most vulnerable customers, although all will be severely impacted, we'll need to capture more information on customers, some of which will be sensitive incoming and outgoings, as well as health issues. Sharing data with the energy providers is impossible, and NHS GPs are even more difficult. So the only way providers will really be able to assist promptly will be to gather and analyze this information. So I guess there's we've got a disagreement. Claire, I'll pass it back to you on that one, and then we'll jump back to Joe's point, because again, Joe, I agree with you. Trust is one of the toughest points. I think if everyone here could just trust, if tenants could trust their housing providers and housing providers could fully trust tenants, we probably wouldn't even be having this discussion. Claire, back to you.
I would obviously this needs a lot more going into, and it needs a data protection risk assessment and everything else if you're thinking about collecting more data. But my challenge would be, well, why can't you help your tenants knowing that everybody is going to be severely impacted? What will you do differently to the people that you know more about their incomings and outgoings? And I don't have an answer for that, and I don't expect you to answer that just now. But that's where my starting point. Like Jill was saying, you've got to be able to show that you're doing something with that data. What will you do differently is my starting point anyway. And that was my point about the protected characteristics that Hazel was saying. What do you do differently for people that you know have certain ethnicities, religion, sexuality, that you don't do for other tenants, that you don't know that about them, but how do you treat them differently? I've not worded that very well, but what do you do differently when you do know people's characteristics versus when you don't know their characteristics? That's my challenge there. And again, I don't expect an answer right now, but that's
but it's a really good point, because evidently that is the issue. Clara said, Hazel, I think you've just described how an old-fashioned management approach, I assume that's going to say is a very good thing, but I'll wait for the rest of the point to come up there. Hazel, let me bring you back in.
It says it's a good thing.
Just going to say around the point around the fuel crisis and cost of living, what we've actually started to do at Bromford is produce some BI reports around heat maps of our older properties, so we know they're going to cost more. We know that the customer is going to be impacted, so that's one very straightforward way that we're looking at it.
That's brilliant.
Then we cross-reference that with our income management teams and the neighbourhood coaches, and we're trying to build up some heat maps. And I'm kind of cautious saying this, Claire, because I'm conscious of you saying, why would you overlap those sorts of data? But actually, if we're remiss in our kind of duty to support people through this, very tricky time. Actually, where does that leave us to? So,
absolutely, but it's as long as this is thought out and documented as to what your purpose is, and then you map that to a legal basis to make it lawful. Otherwise, it's not lawful. If you're mixing and matching data that wasn't originally intended for that purpose, and you've not highlighted and identified a legal basis, it's not lawful. Whatever you do with it wouldn't be lawful, which you've got to take a risk-based approach to. Is that a problem? Or maybe you're willing to take that risk and say, we know it's not lawful, but we think that doing it quickly is more important. as I said to Matt earlier, I never say you must do this or mustn't do that. It's always up to the organisation to take that risk or not. But I just think they need to know that that's what the risk is. But I love that you're starting with the asset data, because that's so much less personal. It is sometimes, it is still personal because you've got people living in the houses, obviously, but starting with asset data of what their EPC data is brilliant.
And
yes,
that's what
it is
Anna's put in the
your
chat there.
data, yes, but it's still personal data as well, because people live in those houses.
But,
So there's a
I guess, like you
crossover.
say, it's still useful as it's, yeah, absolutely. Thomas, let me bring you in.
Yeah, hi. I'm a little bit confused by that. I know that sharing data across different silos can obviously be illegal, but I'm saying, why, if you're looking to improve the lives of your customers, why would it be illegal to use those different silos of data? You already hold that information as long as it's UK GDPR compliant. Why would it be illegal if you're using all of that to create a roadmap or a site map or a project plan? Why would that be considered illegal if that data isn't being shared externally, but it's
okay,
you're already holding that data?
Okay, that's a really wide spread misconception. But first of all, you said if that data is UK GDPR compliant, there's no such thing as UK GDPR compliant anything, because it's a moving feast. The data is a moving feast. The compliance can never be complete, because compliance means you've got everything secure and right. Well, we're moving all the time with what we're doing. So, and the hackers and the cyber attackers are moving all the time as well. So we're never completely secure. We're never completely, we can't tick off GDPR. The other thing you're saying about, it's our data, we're not sharing it. So surely we've got it in-house, we can do what we want with it. What makes data lawful is how you're using it and why you're using it. So you could have data you've collected for one reason and you've told people that you're using it for this reason, another set of data that you've told people you're collecting and using for another reason. You put the two together and you infer something about people, or you either don't put the two, sometimes you don't put data together and you still make inferences, and that could be even worse. You go, oh, well, they're all social housing tenants, so they're all struggling with employment, something like that. But we've got the poll up again, so we're running out of time. Sorry.
It was jumping on. I knew it was automatically set for 11:59. Yeah. So if everyone could have a quick vote on the poll, just based on thoughts today, have your views changed at all in terms of where your thoughts are on, do we have too much data? Do we need it, or whatever the four options were? But do we hold too much data on our tenants?
So I didn't finish that properly, Tom, but I will. I'll find you on LinkedIn if that's okay. We can connect and chat about that properly.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm just
I'll share it in the round table as well.
As it always does, the hour flew by. Thank you everybody for coming today. I don't know about you, but it's certainly opened my eyes to a number of different thoughts and processes kind of around data and where we are on that one. I've got the recording sent over to anyone who wants it. It will go up in the group, in the Social Housing Roundtable group. So if you're not a part of that, please join it. Next week, Jo Leckie, who couldn't join me this week, is joining because she's done a number of complaints reviews with housing providers lately, and she's going to be sharing her findings in a very factual based review of what she's found and where some of the issues and discrepancies are. So that should be excellent. Look forward to seeing you all at that one. I will do a video roundup of this and tag you all in it so that you can connect with each other on LinkedIn. And as ever, if you do need any recruitment support, I'm here to support you, and that's what funds all of these. So my biggest final thank you is to Claire. Thank you for joining me today. You're brilliant.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Very, very interesting questions. And until next time, thank you everybody for coming along.
Bye-bye.